iscouk.org holds the repository of all previous ISCO events, along with the details of membership, and how you can join. You'll also find there the schedule of the upcoming events and other relevant seminars and conferences. So a couple of points before we start. During most of the presentation, your mics will be muted, but we do have a moderated Q&A slot at the end. So please post your questions in the chat box and we can answer them later. The entire session will be recorded and made available on ISCO UK website. So today's session is about coping with complexity, building a knowledge graph for UK Parliament. And I'd like to introduce our speakers. So Michael is a data architect with the Parliamentary Digital Service and is a big fan of librarians. Before joining Parliament, he worked for BBC Research and Development and has been tinkering with the semantic web for many years. Anya is a librarian at the House of Commons Library. She thinks librarians and data architects work well together, but is not inclined to hyperbole. She's hopeful that nuances of knowledge management might avoid being flattened by the relentless march of the machine. So Michael, Anya, over to you.
Thank you, Eugene. Right, so I'm going to try the stressful bit, share screen. Okay, share from beginning. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides and not my notes.
We can see the slides, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so we're here to talk about coping with complexity and building a knowledge graph for UK Parliament. And thank you, Eugene, for the introduction. Here we are again. I'm Anya, obviously, but I'm here with Michael. So we're going to be talking about what Parliament is and what it isn't. We'll talk about how Parliament is structured and what that means for software. We'll talk about what software means for information management. We'll touch on the nature of organisational complexity. And we'll talk about what domain-driven design can do to help out, all in the context of managing information to support secondary legislation. So first up, what is Parliament? To explain Parliament, I need to explain what it isn't. So Parliament is not government. Oh, thank you, Michael.
Sorry.
Where was I? There we go. All right, don't touch my laptop.
Away from the laptop.
Thank you. Right, so Parliament is not government. We often get asked if we're civil servants. We get asked if we work for the Government Digital Service. Neither of these things are true. Technically, we're public servants. The only thing we share with the civil service really is the pubs around Westminster, and civil servants are really bad at queuing in pubs. What is government? So government is accountable to Parliament, and through Parliament, government is accountable to the public. Government proposes new laws, and they run departments from DEFRA to the Home Office. Parliament, on the other hand, is mainly there to hold government to account. It allows input from citizens and it debates current issues in order to influence both government and wider society. The second thing to know about Parliament is that it doesn't exist. There is no single sense of Parliament. There is the House of Commons, which is the democratically elected lower chamber, and there is the House of Lords, the upper chamber of Parliament, to which members are appointed. And there is the Crown, or the Queen in Parliament, which is separate from the Queen as a person. The Queen is the head of state, and she opens Parliament every session and agrees legislation. Over time, the powers of the Crown have diminished. Some matters are still reserved under royal prerogative. That's the name for the powers the Queen has. So these are matters like declaring war, ratifying treaties, or proroguing Parliament, which is calling a period of Parliament to an end. And some of you might remember the whole prorogation thing caused a bit of a fuss during the Brexit period. So Parliament is not a single institution. A realistic drawing might look more like this. At least if we put the Queen to one side for a moment. So the Commons and the Lords are independent organisations. No one is in charge of Parliament. And what's important about that means there's no common rule set between these two organisations, although the way that they operate is interlinked. So if there's no such thing as Parliament, what's that big building about? So I suggest you think of it as a conference centre, hosting two separate but interlinked conferences. Think of it like that and you won't be too far wrong. As some of you know, the word Parliament is derived from a French word, parlement, excuse my accent, which means discussion or discourse. And the third and final thing that you need to know about Parliament is how complicated the internal structures are. So there's a variety of nice signs there for you. There are lots of offices here. They've got names like table office, journal office, vote office, and all of these offices are duplicated in the two houses of Parliament. And those offices are largely autonomous. In each house, you've got one person with oversight of the business of each of those houses. And the workflow between offices and houses is typically facilitated by documents being exchanged at the end of the process of one office, and then we hand it over. So that is Parliament for beginners. Important because we're interested in domain-driven design, so I have to explain a domain to you. Now we've done that, I'll move on to one of the problems we've been trying to solve. In 2018, we were asked to make a publicly available statutory instrument tracking service, and we did, and this talk is kind of about that. But hopefully some of what we cover will be applicable to anywhere and to anything. More background. For those new to statutory instruments, you have Acts of Parliament, and they delegate certain powers to ministers, which means that a minister can create secondary legislation under that act, under those powers, so long as they comply with certain duties towards Parliament. And in the United Kingdom, statutory instruments are the most frequently used type of secondary legislation. And the important thing in terms of timescales for our project to build this SI tracking service was that Brexit was on the horizon, and much of the legislation required to deliver Brexit was expected to arrive in the form of statutory instruments. And indeed it did. And since then, we've been through the pandemic, and again, much of the legislation used to deal with that has also been in the form of statutory instruments. So almost all offices in both houses touch on statutory instrument procedure. Both journal offices, both table offices, and various committees. And that's sort of what this diagram is trying to show you, is the different offices in those houses and the different points of contact that statutory instruments make on their way through Parliament. So in order to track an SI, one needs to track the activities of assorted committees and offices represented here, which when you get down to it means you need to know which committees are likely to look at an SI, and you need to know when those committees will meet, when they'll publish the reports, where they'll publish those reports, and that's just the committee part. So people find it difficult to track the journey of statutory instruments through Parliament, even members of Parliament who have struggled with this. And at this point, you might be thinking, well, this is all very interesting, but it's unlikely that I'll ever have to model a parliamentary procedure in my job. Or you might be thinking this isn't interesting at all, and you're already doom scrolling Twitter. But again, whilst the details may be different, we hope most of this talk is applicable to any reasonably sized organisation. So Michael and I and my team in the House of Commons Library were information modelers and information managers. And we think that the business of tracking a statutory instrument is an information management problem. And information management is often no one's job. And this is where we turn to our trusty iceberg metaphor. Bear with me. So this is where I searched that making websites, doing data visualizations and querying data is relatively easy. Making a data platform and models that are as flexible as Parliament is harder. Managing the information is harder still, And managing the information when it's not in anyone's job description starts to get impossible. You pretty quickly reach the event horizon of the possible. But the problem is more than just about people's jobs and roles. Information management is only ever as good as the tools available. And how those tools are commissioned and paid for influences and constrains the shape of the data they produce. So, given each office has their own view of the problems that they need to solve, we often end up commissioning tools to digitize existing office processes and missing out on the bigger picture. And this is not peculiar to Parliament. Going to a story from Michael, he likes to talk about his time at the BBC a lot. And he says that at the BBC, the people managing talent, so that's the people that you see on TV, would commission a system to handle that. Whereas the people responsible for complaints about what they saw on TV would have their own system to manage that. And broadcast engineers had a system to manage transition times, and the schedulers a system to handle scheduling, and so on. So the systems are not designed to interoperate, so they can never be more than the sum of their disjointed parts. So you may well have heard the phrase, don't put your organizational structure on the web. No one is interested in your reporting lines. But with disjointed information commissioned from the perspective of a single office or a single business unit, this is often inescapable. Right, this picture is of a thing called data.parliament, which is one of Parliament's open data platforms. And hopefully looking at this, even though I don't expect you to read it, the problem with disjointed information is clear. Each large blob on that diagram is pretty much analogous to one of the internal systems. The blob at the top right represents division data, divisions being how members vote in Parliament. And that blob is connected to our data about members, but is not connected to the things that they were voting on. And this is what happens when you have systems like that and you're trying to build a website. So here we've got upwards of 50 domains, none of them really well interlinked. This is an old picture, I should say. Lots of these microsites have now been replaced on Parliament's website, but the general point still holds true. I want to hand over to Michael.
Excellent. So, okay, so Parliament's not complicated. And having listened to what we've said so far, you might be thinking that doesn't make much sense, but please bear with us. So, parliamentary procedure is broadly speaking the rules and conventions being an important word, of how parliamentary business gets done. So the image on the right, they're kind of cobbled together, coloured blocks. We stole from Paul Evans, who's a retired clerk of committees in the House of Commons. And it shows the components that inform procedure. The further down the stack you get, the more immutable. So it is harder to change statute than it is to change standing orders, than it is to improvise around custom and practice. And the larger the block, the more often it comes into play. So you can see statute is actually fairly small. So legislation informs some procedure, but only the bare bones of things. So in order to map procedure, we need to take account of legislation, standing orders, speaker rulings, interpretation and precedents. And we also need to take account of muddling through, because quite a lot of things work by improvisation and muddling through. So taking the components from Paul's diagram from the bottom, there's statute or legislation. This is a picture. So at the opposite corner to Big Ben, the Senegal Victoria Tower in the House of Lords. And this is a room there. It's not the best place on earth to store vellum scrolls, because you have to go up a ladder to get there. So if you ever have to get them out, it's problematic. But this is where all the legislation that's been passed by Parliament is stored. Rolls and rolls of them. And some of the proceedings of the houses are set out in legislation. So for the purposes of this talk, it's mainly the Statutory Instrument Act 1946, but there are others. But in reality, only a very small subset of procedure is set out in legislation. So skipping over resolutions of the House, partly because I don't know what they are. These two booklets are the standing orders. And they're, again, written rules which regulate the proceedings of each house. So they're not legislation, and they're just internal. I mean, everybody knows what a standing order now is after the Twitter lady, the council meeting with standing orders. Yes, and these are ours. There are two sets of rules. There are actually four: one for public business and one for private business. But they're different because the two houses do similar things, but in different ways. In general, the House of Lords is much more permissive with members doing what they want, and the Commons is more governed, and government have more say. Two sets of standing orders. And late legislation, the standing orders don't cover everything. So, on top of the rules, there's precedent, or more generally referred to as custom and practice. So there are things that are permissible because they've been permitted in the past. And like the rest of the UK Constitution, much of parliamentary procedure has developed over centuries. It's not written down. It's understood and improvised. So the booklets, the books there are Erskine May, various editions of Erskine May, and it's Parliament's Bible. Well, it's actually the House of Commons Bible. House of Lords again has a different thing, and it collects precedent in the form of narrative accounts. So there's a fuzzy rule set, and events will test the rules, and the organisation will adapt, and a new process will emerge, and it doesn't end there. Because on top of rules and precedent, there are people. A lot of politics is about people. So some things happen on stage and some things happen off stage. And again, that's like other organisations. So in Parliament, it has a name, it's called usual channels. So that's when the whips of one of the government get together with the whips of the opposition and things are decided slightly off stage. Every organisation has usual channels that are not coded anymore, but they do exist. So even when there are rules, the implementation is subject to interpretation. If you were following Brexit, you might remember that some of Speaker Bercow's interpretation of the rules received quite a lot of attention. And that, it was all set out. Everybody had an understanding of what that meant in standing orders, etc. But they can be reinterpreted. And occasionally, there are no rules set out anywhere, not in legislation, not in standing orders, and there's no precedence either. So we're currently in the midst of mapping a procedure that is not set out in legislation, is not set out in standing orders, and has never happened before. It's just people improvising. And we would say more, but we can't. And again, I think the point is that Parliament's not particularly special. There's lots of organisations have rules and custom and practice, and people, messy bit on top of all of that. People is true anywhere I've ever worked. Give you a second screen. So this is Cynefin. It's a knowledge organisation framework by David Snowden, and it is designed to give organisations a sense of situational awareness and to know what space or spaces they're operating in, and to, having identified the space you're operating in, how to act accordingly. It is not a usual 2x2. He always makes the point. The bit in the middle is when you don't know where you are. And there are lots of things that take you across those lines. So if you try to apply constraints in complex, you'll end up being chaotic. But there are basically different ways of behaving depending on what situation you're in. So if you're in a chaotic situation, being the obvious one, if your bedroom's on fire, you don't make a plan. You do the first thing that comes in your head. So you act, then you sense to see whether that's made any difference, and then you respond. In a complicated situation is the kind of more traditional business analyst user research thing. So you do enough sensing and analysing up front, and then you respond. And in a complex situation, a complex situation is non-linear. So the only thing you can do, you can't make a plan. You don't know what you don't know. So you probe and sense and respond. You do a thing, see how it changes the disposition of the system. Getting back to Parliament. So a lot of software in Parliament and in other places is built on the understanding that Parliament operates in a complicated space. And whilst there are some bits of Parliament that are complicated, at heart it is a complex adaptive system. I mean, is it designed to be? It is loosely governed so that it can adapt. It's evolutionary. So this is why you'll often hear us banging on about emergent behaviours, should you ever encounter it on Twitter. So if you tightly couple the implementation of software and data models to define rule sets, it makes the software and the resulting information brittle and then liable to break when the underlying rule sets change or adapted or reinterpreted. So we're sure that there'll be someone in the audience familiar with a piece of software that's asking for a mandatory field to be filled in when that information does not exist anymore. So in all the things we do, in all the systems we build, we might wish to be conservative on output, but we're always liberal on input. Cool. So in order to make services that meet needs outside individual offices, we need to step back and look for new patterns that don't stop at individual commissioning office walls. And we need to be aware of both complications and complexity. So this is our Bible. It's a book called Domain-Driven Design by Eric Evans. A friend described it as being somewhere between profound and self-evident, and that's the feeling that you get when you read it. It's like, oh my word, yes, this is how you should do software. And then, well, yeah, it's so obvious, but it's worth a read. The first 3 chapters are brilliant. It gets a bit, it's too much. It's too heavy book, So this is. So you may have heard of Agile and Agile development practices, and Agile is a response to a complex situation and the need to probe and sense and then respond. So you can't plan too much ahead. You do a thing, you look how the disposition of the system changes. Domain-driven design came from the Agile development community, and it's Agile emphasises collaboration over contract negotiation, and domain-driven design is the same. It emphasises collaboration, but usually the collaboration takes the form of gathering around whiteboards and lots of listening and lots of talking. I mean, that's all been a little bit difficult over the last few months, so we've improvised our way around it there. Quite a lot of the work is probing for definitions and always accepting that the same words may have different definitions in different contexts. So this is particularly true in Parliament, where the 2 houses have evolved separately and something with the same meaning has kind of diverged in the same word has diverged in meaning across the two houses. And importantly, in domain-driven design, it's not about a person speaking and another person drawing. So the aim is to draw back at each other. So the best sessions we have are where a domain expert grabs the pen and just gets bored and starts drawing when you don't understand, and that does it great. So there's a quote from Eric Evans. It says, if you give someone a diagram, they'll agree with you. If you get them to draw it, you see the difference. So we were in a meeting the other day where someone from the digital service was showing us high-level design documents, and that's not the point of. You don't want somebody to pop up with a diagram they've already got. You want to draw it out and keep drawing it out and just test it. And the aim is to explore the domain from as many perspectives as possible. So we have some tips for design modeling, but earlier today we kind of practiced this with a friend, and he kind of pointed this. There's kind of a missing slide somewhere, so I'm going to talk about a missing slide. There are people that I've met that think that if you know what a subjective objective predicate is, you know what a named graph is, you know what a subclass is, you know what transitivity is, and you've got a computer and you've got a copy of Protégé, you can sit down and do ontology work. And that's not where the work is. I think for every day that we spend at a whiteboard, we might spend 40 minutes at a computer. We don't spend an awful lot of time at computers. It's all about talking to people. So that's what this next bit is about. There are some tips here, and they're just things that have worked for us. There are, as ever, no silver bullets, so your mileage may vary. So this is where we're pleased to be speaking at a virtual event, because we might get heckled off stage at any skills for metadata. And the slide is incorrect. So there's such a thing as metadata. It's just not usually what people mean when they say it. So thinking about the author of a book as being metadata about that book is not true. The author of a book is a person. An artist performing a music track is a person or a group of people. Picking an example from that I would pick, Factory Records was an organisation. It wasn't some text in a metadata field of that organisation. And I think this is possibly one of the trickiest things when people are moving away from taxonomies towards ontologies. When you're domain modeling, you're always thinking about things and the thinginess of the things, not metadata that leads you down roads that you don't explore fully what that thing is. I think this gets back to Cynefin as well. So when you arrive at a domain modeling session, you'll probably have some questions in mind. And sometimes the conversation will drift away from the questions that you've got, and you need to let it drift. There are in the world user researchers that will arrive somewhere with a script and stick to the script, and you're trying you're not the expert in the room. You're letting the conversation flow around you and seeing where it takes you, because there are things you don't know. Other tips, yes. So try not to be hide behind a professional persona, which is easy perhaps for some than others. Active listening has become a bit of a cliche, but it's useful in these situations, and it's exhausting. So you should never attempt a domain modeling session alone, because you'll end up drawing and you will tune out and you won't take in what people are saying. So it's useful to have somebody around that you can kind of pass the attention baton to, and then you come out and swap notes and talk about it, and there'll be bits that you don't even remember being discussed. And yeah, empathy is also overused these days. Be empathetic and try to see things from the participant's perspective. So, whatever statisticians may tell us a pool of anecdote is data, I mean, you know, for some definition. There's a picture from the book Event Storming, which is also great. We'll show you many people will recognise the thing in an organisation where only Pauline from accounts knows how a system works, and Pauline left 5 years ago. That's in any complex environment, it relies more on narrative than rules. People share stories, and the stories shape the environment. So, Dave Snowden, again of Cynefin fame, has brilliant observations about the value of stories in workplaces, kind of informal knowledge exchange. It's often helpful to invite more than one domain expert to a session, and it can be really helpful if there are different levels of seniority, but not so far separated that they're afraid to disagree. You won't. The best sessions we ever do start with a disagreement. It's like, has this ever happened? No, this has never happened. Well, actually, in 1976, when this government were in power and this came through, this happened, and they disagree, and then you get the stories. That's great stuff. Yes, the heading on this slide is taken from the Cluetrain Manifesto, so that's why that's there. How organisations think they work and how they work are two different things. So you've probably been in receipt of a cascaded email saying please cascade to your team, and everybody in the organisation already knew the contents because they gossiped in lists or in a cigarette break or something. So you need to understand how networks work in your organisation and know that your organisation is porous. So Twitter is useful for the bits that poke in and out of an organisation. And lastly, the best people with the best stories are retired people. So this is David Beamish, the ex-clerk of the Parliament. That's the top job in the House of Lords. We work with a number of retired clerks because when it comes to saying, well, actually in 1976 this happened, they know they were there. They have the experience and they have the stories. All right, more tips. Yeah, more tips. These are kind of questions that we tend to ask, or things we tend to talk about. So trying not to conflate the identity of something with the naming or labeling of things. So this is a recurrent problem in a lot of our systems. We identify parliamentary sessions, so a unit of time in Parliament, by their start and end dates, as an identifier, not just a label. And the end dates change, and then the systems go awry. Thinking about agency, thinking about separating out what's a thing with agency. So you might be talking about geographies, and you might be saying, well, a lower tier local authority is a thing with agency, it's not just a geography. FEBRA is functional requirements for bibliographic records. FEBRA is handy for all kinds of things way beyond books and documents. And always ask questions around cardinality. So how many of those things can that thing have is one of the best questions you can ever ask any of these things. So this slide has no basis in science. It is based on experience that so many information projects flounder on the rocks of incorrect cardinality. So, right, okay, so back to our slides. Let's have that slight detour into Cynefin. When we first started, everyone we spoke to turned up with a flowchart, a kind of Word document, clip art style flowcharts that that every organisation has. They were all drawn from a certain perspective, and none of them were complete. So over several months, we talked and sketched and brought together as many different perspectives as possible. And this is the procedure model that emerged. It's a process model that's implemented as an RDF ontology. Procedure just being Parliament's fancy word for process. It allows us to state that given what has happened, what may, must, and can't happen next. And it's important to say that Clark wouldn't recognise the model. It's generic, it's just a process. There's no domain knowledge or domain language encoded in the map itself. So whilst the map's generic, well, the model is generic, over the top of the model, there are all these procedure maps. And most of our time in Clerks is spent mapping procedures like this. You probably can't see very much of it, but it's a logical arithmetic procedure map for the made affirmative statutory instrument procedure. Okay, you may have noticed that in all of this, we've been talking about the domain, but we haven't really been talking about what users might need from an XI tracking service. And we find that the emphasis on user needs isn't terribly helpful. So by concentrating on describing the domain, you don't lock yourself into a single solution and you're not building towards an idealized end state. You often find that different groups of users have different needs. In our case, our users have needs that are often diametrically opposed. The needs of the Government Whip Office are not just different to the needs of the Opposition Whip Office, they are. So that's the nature of politics. I think that's why I last.
Right, so after all that talking and sketching and listening to lots of stories, so I'll take you through what we actually made. So this is the statutory instrument website that Parliament asked for. It is an actual website, not just a picture of one. You can use it on the public web to find out about SIs that are before Parliament. And this website can flex and adapt as Parliament flexes and adapts. So in collaboration with the Journal Office and committees, my colleague Jane is making changes to those procedure maps on almost a weekly basis. And that isn't because we did it wrong, that's because procedure evolves. And by understanding the domain and choosing the right binded context, we could do more. Because we have that generic model for procedure, we can, with relative ease, map new procedures over the top of it. So post-Brexit, treaties became rather important, and in 2019 we were asked to build a tracking service for treaties. And this is a map of the treaty procedure as set out by the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010. And this is that same map, probably quite hard to read on your screens at home, but it was drawn by machines based on the data that we put in around how the treaty procedure works. So with almost no work, we made a website for tracking treaties, and there is a library of queries for treaty procedure as well. So we already mentioned, and Michael did, that the maps can be parsed by machines, and they can determine, based on what has happened, what may happen next, or what must happen next, or what shouldn't happen next. Michael calls this the light-cone of procedural possibilities. So we can use this data to alert members to things that are in their interest, really, and a part of their duty. So it points them to points at which, in a procedure, they can intervene. So for a statutory instrument, there's a window, and this data can be used to say to a member, from this point on, and for the next 40 days, you can table an objection to this statutory instrument. We also have a pot of data that we can query for precedence. So some of you might recognize this is a Sparkle query. This is something we actually use to support staff working across Parliament, people who are answering questions about statutory instruments, and people who are managing the procedure of statutory instruments going through Parliament. The sorts of queries we can use to answer it are things like, when did X and Y both happen, and when did Z not happen? So quite common precedent type queries. And we can use the pot of data to look for patterns. I should credit Phil Borman for producing this. So this is one example showing the number of days between the laying and approval of draft affirmative instruments. How long did it take for Parliament to say yes to this thing? And most important about all of this is those queries are repeatable. Another thing we made, strangely enough, nobody asked for Twitter bots for statutory instruments and treaties, but after a couple of hours work, we made them, and we now have 239, that's out of date, 239 people following avidly to statutory instruments laid before Parliament. So information management is hard work, and understanding the domain isn't quick. But well-modeled, well-managed information is generative. Possibilities merge when you take the time to try and understand the domain. So we often ask ourselves, if Erskine May, the chap who first wrote that book on precedents of Parliament, if he had had a computer, what would he have done? And we think, possibly, would have used it to build a graph of knowledge of parliamentary business and built a precedence engine out of data. Nearly there, just when you thought you were rid of us. And afterward, we're back with Dave Snowden. Dave Snowden talks about retrospective coherence. In other words, we tell ourselves stories to make what has happened seem like it was inevitable. This talk and most other talks being great examples of that. So in retrospect, we can make it sound like we knew what we were doing, make it sound like we had a plan, that we always knew we were working towards machine-readable parliamentary procedure. We did not know this. Like much else, we muddled through. And any narrative we may have attempted in this talk is only possible through the benefit of hindsight. You shouldn't trust our story any more than you trust any other. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Well, that's a lot of details.
Sorry.
Thank you. Looking at the chat box for the Q&A. So we'd love to move to Q&A. Haven't seen a lot of questions yet, so let me maybe kick it off with a couple of questions of my own. So you talked about UK Parliament environment being complex and working with in a sort of agile way. Can you perhaps talk about how you design for evolution of the ontologies and the models that you build? Perhaps talk about some of the patterns there.
The procedure stuff, no, not really. The procedure model has stayed relatively static for all the time. The maps over the top of that are almost like a model that sits over a model. So they are the things that change all the time, but that's all managed as instance data. So we are managing the maps as instance data, and there's no redeploy. We have made changes to the ontology for other reasons. So it became apparent at some point that we needed to say that this route is no longer applicable. We needed to put time boundness on stuff. So there have been that. The ontologies are versioned in the standard fashion, but most of the stuff we're talking about here is managed as instance data.
Okay.
So it's librarians managing this. It's not ontology deployment.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, we have a question from Liz Wilson. How did you get this work underway? Who commissioned it? And not sure how this question reads, but what to do to begin with, I think is the question. So how did you get it underway? Who commissioned it? Where to begin?
To be officially commissioned by one of the offices, one of the procedural offices in the House of Commons, so the Journal Office. They were the ones, I think, who were most often being asked questions about statutory instruments. And so they were anticipating a flood of questions coming over the hill when, Brexit was really seriously getting underway. And concerns about, an awareness that there was issues with understanding statutory instruments on Parliament's own websites and thinking this is a massive national constitutional event and we can do better. So all credit to them for commissioning it. I think we were lucky in terms of deciding how to go about it. It's sort of, statutory instruments are quite niche. It's unfair. They're really important, but they're fairly niche. So I think we were able to operate under the radar, and that's something I would try and do from now on. Never say yes to a big project. Never never agree to something that's going to save the world. Just to try and do something that everyone is slightly devalued, and yeah, then emerge. Let it emerge. Let it speak for itself. And so we had a lot of freedom, I think, in deciding how to approach it. And then we benefited from the way that we approached it, because it meant, like we say, we could build lots of other things on top of it, things that nobody asked for. It was quite fortunate. So we met the brief and did more, but possibly because we weren't confined to that usual thing of I want so that I can project timeline. We were fairly free.
I think that the people commissioning it would have been happy with a WordPress thing and some text boxes that they typed into, etc. I don't think there was. I think there was some confusion that we were coming at them from really deeply trying to understand the procedure, understanding all of the legislation.
Yeah.
And I don't think they knew for a little while why we're asking such questions. Like, why would the people building a website be this much interested in the details?
People were very patient with us. That was feedback at the end. They're like, a lot of the time I had no idea why this was important, this question. We see it now. So we were lucky, I think, with having some very patient and engaged stakeholders.
Thank you. Okay, so another question from Leah Dickerson. Do you collaborate with other UK public institutions for non-parliament things like names, countries, and so on?
We try. I mean, it's not. We cooperate quite a lot with the TNA and legislation.
DNA is the National Archives, so that's the home of legislation. So we test some of our models with them, we've got an eye on interoperability with them as the publishers of legislation. But things like countries.
We had great hope for GDS registers until that got canned. I mean, I think the thing about Parliament is it's really porous. So we are mastering data we shouldn't really be doing. So we're mastering boundary data. We're mastering peerage data, which is the College of Arms. We're mastering electoral data, which is
The
the Electoral Commission. And we shouldn't be managing that, but none of these organisations are in a state that we can do. We can just point at an API and take that data, apart from whatever John Sheridan's doing at legislation.
Okay, thanks. Question from David Haynes. What software did you use for the development of the knowledge graph?
Whiteboards.
Brilliant. Maybe I should add to this question. From whiteboards to knowledge graph, are you trying to do something in the middle? Are you trying to use some software to manage these whiteboard sessions, or you sort of go whiteboard and then you sit in front of Protege? So
the models go into OmniGraph and get sketched by hand. They go into TextMate. There's no Protege. They go into other people use Vi or whatever, but they're in a text editor. The technology of the it's a GraphDB instance, and then it's on Azure with a lot of logic apps that are doing the ETL into that. And there's very little code other than to stand up the triple store and tear it down. So it's all infrastructure as code, but most of the stuff's in the ETL, trying to get things out of these systems that are not in the right shape and somehow reshape them, with some side loading of data from all other places to try and correct that stuff. But from our point of view, no Protege, none of that, no, just sex tests.
Thank you. And question from David Watkins. Does this mean parliamentarians felt they were on top of statutory instruments and procedures before the Brexit flurry? What exactly made them realize they were not?
We had, what's the definition of parliamentarians? Officials, MPs, we speak for them. I can't say whether they felt they were on top of it. I think it was widely acknowledged that it was difficult to understand, but there were routes to answer questions about it, but those routes had friction. So it was about building up that knowledge to understand how it worked and knowing who to ask. Who do I need to email? What office do I need to visit? So I'd say there was ways of understanding it, but it was full of friction, and it'd been very difficult without building up procedural knowledge in the first place.
The House of Lords have a published telephone number for the Journal office. telegrams. Most of the inquiries came by telephone. There was there were things called delegated legislation committees in the Commons that scrutinised secondary legislation, and their membership, whether you were the membership changes on an almost weekly basis, and that was on a poster on the tea room wall. So whether you found out you're a member or not, yeah, this is the level of slight messiness that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps time for another for probably last question, because we're almost at time. From Richard Weavers, as a librarian, I'm interested in your professional journey. Can you give us a brief resume? I guess, yeah, beyond a couple of sentences in the beginning.
I qualified as a librarian in 2007. Before that, I was a bookseller. And when I was doing my master's degree, I took both CAS and CLAS modules. I thought it was amazing. So that's, I think, mainly how I find myself here, because happily, the House of Commons Library has a whole team dedicated to managing taxonomies and subject indexing and annotating and describing things in a way that I guess other libraries may have stopped doing. So moving on from modelling things to sort of from a document level and thinking about taxonomies to moving to thinking about the thingness of things, ontologies, it's sort of followed, but lots of it's luck. It's about what you end up working on and who you end up working with. Michael's not a librarian. I don't know if that question is answered to him. No?
I don't know.
Wouldn't be able to tell.
Well, I can give you an answer. So I started off in HCI and kind of front end and then web, and gradually moved back down the technology stack. So from HTML into code and then into databases. It was just basically, you can't solve this at the interface level. I'll move further back. You can't solve it here. You can't solve it here. And now I'm kind of in database and triple store land, and then you realise you can't solve it there either because you need to move into finance. So, yeah, that's the only place that you can actually solve software.
Unsigned processes.
Right. Thanks. Well, actually, we do probably have time for the last question then. So from Max Border, you spoke about the importance of not confounding taxonomies and ontologies. In that context, how do you talk with people who find it difficult to not think in taxonomies / categorically?
I mean, I think going back to Snowden again, he would say that what we talk about as ontologies are not ontologies. They're not knowledge frameworks. They're just a decorated taxonomy. So an RDFO ontology is not an ontology in a philosophical sense. So I don't think the journey is that hard. I do think that stuff around what is metadata and getting away from that to start thinking about what is the thing described and is it worth describing? We have a taxonomy, we can't model the world and everything touches Parliament. So you need subject indexing as well. It's that where does the modelled and the conceptual, where do you draw the line? Where do you stop modelling?
Yeah. Great. Well, that was great. Thank you. Thanks, Anya, Michael. So
Thank you very much.
I guess I'd also like to say thanks to Arif, Nikki, Phil, and Tara from ISCO UK meetup team for helping organize these events. And I'd like to talk a little bit about our next meetup that is on 23rd of November at noon UK time, and it will be a hands-on session where we introduce Wikibase, which is powerful, flexible, customizable knowledge-based software that drives Wikidata. Georgina Burnett and Mohammed Sadat Abdullah from Wikimedia Foundation will talk about the basics, talk about use cases and the data model, and then Phil, Stacy, and I will run the hands-on session, hands-on portion of the event. You'll find more information on meetup.com and ISCO UK in the next couple of weeks. So that's it for today, and we'll see you in November, and goodbye for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anya and Michael.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Good night.